Elena pushed back from the microscope, her chair wheels squeaking against the linoleum like a mouse in distress. The lab's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sickly pallor that made her olive skin look corpse-gray. She rubbed her eyes, hoping fatigue was playing tricks on her vision, but when she looked again, the cellular structures remained impossibly active. Normal blood cells moved predictably under magnification, red discs floating like lazy boats in plasma. These cells undulated with purpose, their membranes rippling in synchronized waves that reminded her uncomfortably of breathing. More disturbing were the crystalline formations she'd never encountered in human samples, geometric patterns that seemed to catch light from sources that shouldn't exist under her microscope. The lab felt colder suddenly, despite the desert heat pressing against the windows. Elena had chosen the night shift for a reason. Fewer interruptions, less small talk with colleagues who might notice how she flinched when they mentioned family picnics or childhood memories. The silence usually comforted her, but tonight it felt pregnant with possibility, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She reached for the case file with trembling fingers. 3 photographs stared back at her. Amira, age 8, with dark eyes too, knowing for her years, Yasmin, 10, whose smile seemed painted on, and Layla, 12, who looked at the camera with the weary expression of someone much older. All 3 had been found by a trucker named Bill Henderson at 2:17 a.m., walking single file down the highway's shoulder like they were heading to school instead of emerging from 6 months of oblivion. Elena flipped through their intake photos from different foster homes across Nevada. Amira had been placed after her mother died in a car accident, no known father. Yasmin was surrendered at birth, parents unknown. Layla had been removed from a neglectful grandmother who swore the girl could make objects move without touching them. A claim social services dismissed as the ravings of an alcoholic. Different backgrounds, different tragedies, different faces. Yet their DNA was so similar they could have been identical triplets. Elena's own abandoned childhood clawed at her thoughts. Memories of sterile hallways and strangers in white coats, of being moved from facility to facility with no explanation. She'd been found on a roadside too, though in New Mexico rather than Nevada, clutching a piece of paper with her name written in Arabic script she couldn't read. The social workers said she was approximately 5 years old, but Elena had no memories from before that desert morning. She'd spent decades building a career on the certainty of scientific evidence, on the reliability of genetic code that never lied. DNA didn't care about your feelings or fears, it simply was. But looking at these samples felt like staring into a mirror that reflected something she wasn't prepared to see. The lab phone rang, shrill in the silence. Elena jumped, knocking over her cold coffee. The brown liquid spread across her notes like blood at a crime scene. Nevada State Crime Lab, Dr. Vasquez speaking. Dr. Vasquez? This is Dr. Sarah Chen at Vegas General. I'm calling about the 3 girls you're running tests on. Elena mopped coffee with paper towels, phone cradled against her shoulder. The Haddar girls? What about them? Something strange is happening. They've been catatonic since intake, but around midnight all 3 started speaking in unison. Same words, same rhythm, like they're connected somehow. What are they saying? A pause. We recorded it, but our translator says it's an archaic form of Arabic. Something about the blood remembering and children of fire returning home. The nurses are spooked. The girls' room temperature dropped 20 degrees and the EKG machines are picking up synchronized heart rhythms. Elena's hand stilled on the paper towels. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the lab's windows with increasing intensity. Sand peppered the glass like tiny fists demanding entry. Dr. Vasquez, are you there? I'm here. Dr. Chen, have you noticed anything unusual about their blood work? Any anomalies in the cellular structure? That's why I'm calling. My lab tech ran their CBC 3 times because the results don't make sense. Their white blood cell count is through the roof, but they show no signs of infection. It's like their immune systems are fighting something we can't detect. Elena stared at the microscope, where 3 slides of impossible blood waited for explanation. Through the window, she could see heat lightning flickering on the horizon, illuminating the desert in brief, ghostly snapshots. Dr. Chen, I need you to keep those girls isolated. No visitors, no media. Can you do that? Already done. Elena, if I can call you that, in 30 years of pediatric medicine, I've never seen anything like this. What exactly are we dealing with? Elena looked down at her notes, now stained with coffee and doubt. The truth was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially when she didn't understand it herself. I don't know yet, she said finally, but I'm going to find out. Elena hung up the phone and stared at the coffee-stained notes spread across her desk like evidence of her own unraveling. The lab's air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical wheeze, but the artificial cold couldn't chase away the heat that seemed to radiate from the microscope slides themselves. She pulled out a fresh notebook, her third this month, and began documenting everything with the methodical precision that had carried her through graduate school and 15 years at the crime lab. Time, 2:47 a.m. Subjects, 3 female minors, ages 8 to 12. DNA analysis shows 99% genetic similarity despite different biological origins. Her pen hovered over the page. How did you scientifically describe cells that moved like living creatures? The routine of documentation calmed her, each careful notation a small barrier against the impossible. Elena had built her entire adult life on routines, arriving at the lab at 11 p.m. sharp, checking voicemails first, then reviewing active cases in order of priority. She ate the same turkey sandwich at 3 a.m., took a coffee black and finished paperwork before dawn broke over the spring mountains. Predictability was armor against a childhood that had been anything but predictable. Her desk drawer stuck as she pulled it open, warped from years of desert heat. Inside, beneath extra pens and reading glasses, lay the only photograph from her early life. Herself at maybe 7 years old, standing outside what looked like a medical facility. She was small and serious, dark hair braided with ribbons that seemed too cheerful for her solemn expression. A woman's hand rested on her shoulder, but the photo was torn, leaving only painted fingernails and part of a white coat sleeve. Elena had carried this photograph through 17 foster homes, 3 universities, and 2 failed relationships. Men who wanted to know about her family, her childhood traditions, her first memories. When she explained that her earliest clear recollection was a social worker's office in Albuquerque, they'd try to be understanding. But eventually, the absence of her past became too large a space in their shared future. A phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, her most recent attempt at normalcy. Working late again? Come over when you're done. Left some wine breathing. Marcus taught high school chemistry and collected vintage microscopes, facts that had seemed like cosmic alignment when they'd met at a forensics conference 6 months ago. He made her laugh, cooked elaborate meals, and never pushed when she deflected questions about her family. But lately, even his patience felt fragile. She typed back, case running long. Rain check? The lie came easily. Everything was a case running long when your past was evidence you couldn't process. The lab's emergency lighting flickered on briefly, casting red shadows across the walls before the regular fluorescents resumed their steady hum. Through the windows, Elena could see the security guard making his rounds, flashlight beam dancing across empty parking spaces. George had worked building security for 8 years, arriving each evening with thermos of coffee and stories about his grandchildren. He was probably the closest thing she had to family, which said something pathetic about her life. Elena's pager buzzed. Another case coming in from the field. 3 bodies found in a Summerlin home, possible domestic violence situation. She should prep the lab, pull the necessary reagents, begin the familiar choreography of cataloging violence. Instead, she found herself drawn back to the microscope. Under magnification, the girl's blood cells continued their impossible dance. She'd run every test in her arsenal: flow cytometry, electrophoresis, PCR amplification. The results defied explanation, yet her instruments weren't malfunctioning. The crystalline structures within their cells resembled nothing in any medical textbook, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional. She thought about Dr. Chen's words, "children of fire returning home." Elena had never learned Arabic, despite the script on that paper found with her as a child. She'd tried once in college, enrolling in a Middle Eastern Studies course, but hearing the language spoken aloud had triggered panic attacks that sent her fleeing to the campus health center. Her reflection caught in the microscope's mirror. Tired eyes, graying temples, the permanent squint lines of someone who spent her life examining other people's secrets. At 52, Elena had achieved professional respect, financial stability, and a reputation for solving the unsolvable. She had a condo with a view of Red Rock Canyon, a reliable car, and retirement savings that would allow her to travel if she ever figured out where she wanted to go. It should have been enough. Some days she almost convinced herself it was enough. But nights like this, surrounded by evidence of mysteries that science couldn't explain, Elena felt the familiar ache of belonging nowhere. She'd spent decades studying genetic markers, tracing bloodlines through chromosomes and proteins, helping other people understand their biological histories. Yet her own DNA remained unexamined, locked away in the same mental vault where she'd buried everything that came before that desert morning in New Mexico. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded her of incense and old books and places she'd never been but somehow remembered. The phone rang again. Elena's hand hovered over the receiver, her heart hammering against her ribs. The phone's shrill cry cut through the lab's mechanical hum like a scream, and something deep in her chest whispered that answering would change everything. She could let it ring, focus on the Summerlin case, pretend the impossible blood samples were someone else's problem. The choice hung in the fluorescent-lit air like a held breath. She picked up on the fifth ring. "Dr. Vasquez? This is Agent Rebecca Morrison, FBI." The voice was crisp, professional, with an undercurrent of urgency that made Elena's mouth go dry. "I need to speak with you about the 3 minors you're processing, the Haddar girls." Elena's free hand instinctively moved to cover the microscope slides, as if protecting evidence from a predator. "How do you know about—" "Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to ask you to stop all testing immediately and secure the samples. I'm en route to your facility with a federal seizure order." The words hit like ice water. Elena had worked hundreds of cases, interfaced with federal agencies on everything from serial killers to terrorism investigations. She knew the protocols, the careful dance of jurisdictional authority, but this felt different, hungrier, more desperate. On what grounds? These girls are victims, not suspects. They need medical care, not federal intervention. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but this is a matter of national security. The samples you're analyzing contain classified biological markers. Any further testing could compromise an ongoing investigation." Elena's gaze fell on the photograph tucked beside her keyboard. Herself at 7, that woman's hand on her shoulder, the medical facility in the background. Her childhood had been punctuated by men and women in suits who spoke in the same clipped tones, who moved her from place to place with clinical efficiency and no explanations. "What kind of biological markers?" Elena pressed, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. A pause. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that. Please prepare the samples for transfer. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Elena stared at the phone like it had betrayed her, then slowly replaced the receiver. Through the windows, the desert wind had picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the parking lot like fleeing spirits. The emergency lighting flickered again, longer this time, bathing the lab in hellish red. She looked at the microscope slides, 3 drops of impossible blood that might hold answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask for 47 years. In 20 minutes, they'd be gone, disappeared into the same bureaucratic machine that had swallowed her own origins. Her hands shook as she reached for her notebook, scribbling down everything she could remember. The synchronized cellular movement, the crystalline formations, the genetic similarities that defied biological possibility. The pager buzzed again with the Summerlin case update, but Elena ignored it. Instead, she found herself pulling out her security badge, studying the magnetic strip that recorded her every movement through the building. If she was going to act, it had to be now. before Agent Morrison arrived with her seizure orders and convenient explanations. Elena had spent decades being the good scientist, the reliable employee, the woman who colored within the lines and never asked uncomfortable questions. She'd built a career on following protocols, respecting authority, trusting that institutions would protect the innocent. But institutions had failed those three girls just as they'd failed her all those years ago in New Mexico. Her reflection stared back from the microscope's mirror, tired, middle-aged, unremarkable. The face of someone who'd learned early that invisibility was safety, that asking too many questions led to unpleasant consequences. But beneath that practiced anonymity, something else flickered. The stubborn curiosity that had driven her to become a scientist in the first place, the hunger for truth that no amount of institutional conditioning had managed to kill. She thought about the girls at Vegas General, speaking in unison about blood remembering and children of fire. Their synchronized heartbeats, the 20-degree temperature drop, Dr. Chen's spooked nurses, whatever was happening to them, it was accelerating, and taking their blood samples away wouldn't stop it. It would just ensure no one understood it. Elena opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small cooler she used for transporting samples between labs. Her hands moved with the efficiency of 15 years' experience, preparing slides and vials with the kind of careful documentation that would hold up in court. If she was going to steal federal evidence, she was going to do it right. The wind outside had become a howl, and somewhere in its voice she heard echoes of languages she'd never learned, but somehow recognized. The emergency lighting flickered once more, and in that brief red illumination, Elena made her choice. She slipped the samples into the cooler, grabbed her keys and badge, and headed for the door. Behind her, the phone began ringing again, but this time she didn't look back. The lab's rear exit opened onto a service alley that reeked of dumpster fluid and automotive exhaust. Elena clutched the cooler against her chest like a shield, her badge hand trembling as she swiped through the security door. The desert wind hit her immediately, hot, gritty, carrying voices that seemed to whisper her name in languages she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. 3 steps into the alley, she froze. What was she doing? 47 years of careful, methodical living, and she was throwing it away for 3 vials of blood that shouldn't exist. Elena pressed her back against the building's concrete wall, feeling the stored heat seep through her lab coat. In the distance, she could hear the hum of Interstate 15, that ribbon of asphalt where the girls had been found walking like sleepwalkers toward an unknown destination. Her career would be over. Not just terminated, destroyed. Agent Morrison would ensure she never worked in forensics again, probably never worked in any lab again. Theft of federal evidence, obstruction of justice, violation of national security protocols. The charges would follow her like radioactive contamination, poisoning every reference, every background check, every attempt to rebuild. And for what? Blood samples that defied explanation from 3 traumatized children who spoke in dead languages? Elena had built her entire adult identity on rational skepticism, on the comforting certainty that everything could be explained through careful observation and scientific method. The impossible didn't exist, only insufficient data and flawed analysis. But she'd checked her work 6 times, run controls, calibrated instruments, verified results with equipment that had passed its last certification with flying colors. The girl's DNA wasn't just similar, it was identical in ways that biology couldn't produce. The cellular structures moved with purpose, formed patterns that resembled writing, responded to observation like they were aware of being watched. Elena's phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. "Everything okay? You've been distant lately." She stared at the message, thinking about his vintage microscopes and patient smile, his assumption that her reluctance to discuss the past was merely shyness rather than active self-preservation. In 6 months of dating, she'd told him almost nothing true about herself, not about the foster homes, the recurring nightmares, the panic attacks triggered by certain sounds and smells. What would happen if she went to his house tonight, cooler in hand, and explained that she'd stolen evidence of impossible children with impossible blood? that she suspected her own DNA might reveal similar impossibilities. Marcus taught chemistry to teenagers. His idea of professional crisis was running out of litmus paper. He couldn't understand that some discoveries came with costs that exceeded their value. The sound of approaching vehicles made her stomach clench. Headlights swept across the alley's mouth, federal cars probably, with Agent Morrison and her seizure orders. Elena had maybe 2 minutes before they surrounded the building, sealed every exit, treated her like a terrorist instead of a scientist following her conscience. But was she following conscience or childhood trauma? Elena had spent decades in therapy learning to recognize the difference between intuition and hypervigilance, between genuine threats and the phantom dangers that haunted abuse survivors. Her therapist, Dr. Williams, would call this behavior trauma reenactment, recreating dangerous situations because chaos felt more familiar than stability. Maybe the girl's blood was exactly what Agent Morrison claimed, classified biological markers from some legitimate government research program. Maybe Elena's recognition of the cellular patterns was pareidolia, her pattern-seeking brain finding meaning in random configurations. Maybe her entire career had been an elaborate attempt to solve the mystery of her own origins, and she was projecting that obsession onto 3 innocent children. The headlights grew brighter. Elena heard car doors slamming, radio chatter, the efficient movement of federal agents who'd done this before. Her window of escape was closing like a steel trap, but her feet remained frozen to the asphalt. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she was making the worst mistake of her life, that she should return to the lab immediately, surrender the samples with dignity, accept whatever consequences followed. But deeper than rationality, in places where memory and instinct tangled like DNA strands, Elena felt the familiar weight of institutional power pressing down. The same feeling from those childhood interviews where adults with clipboards asked questions she couldn't answer about places she couldn't remember. The polite violence of being moved and catalogued and studied without ever being truly seen. She thought about Amira, Yasmin, and Layla at Vegas General, speaking in unison about blood remembering while their body temperatures dropped and their hearts beat in supernatural synchronization. Whatever was happening to them transcended normal medical intervention. They needed someone who understood the weight of unexplained histories, the burden of belonging nowhere. Elena's grip tightened on the cooler. Behind her, she could hear Agent Morrison's voice echoing through the lab's corridors, sharp with authority and barely contained frustration. The federal seizure was already in motion, but the most crucial evidence was standing in an alley, paralyzed between fear and determination, holding the future in a container designed for transporting groceries. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like home to a woman who'd never had one. Elena's feet began moving before her mind caught up, carrying her deeper into the alley's shadows. The cooler bumped against her hip with each hurried step, its contents infinitely precious and impossibly dangerous. Behind her, Agent Morrison's voice grew louder, commanding her team through the lab with military precision. The sound triggered something primal in Elena's nervous system, the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned that adults with authority meant displacement, separation, erasure. She reached her car just as the emergency lighting flickered on again, bathing the alley in crimson. For a split second, Elena saw herself reflected in the Honda's window, wild-haired, clutching stolen evidence about to cross a line that would define the rest of her life. The woman staring back looked nothing like the careful scientist who'd arrived for her shift 8 hours earlier. The engine turned over on the second try. Elena pulled out of the alley without headlights, navigating by memory in the faint glow of distant street lamps. In her rearview mirror, she watched federal agents stream from the lab's rear exit like antibodies responding to infection. Their flashlight beams swept across empty pavement, missing her departure by seconds. Interstate 15 stretched ahead, that same ribbon of asphalt where 3 impossible children had been found walking toward Vegas with no memory of where they'd been. Elena's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she merged into sparse midnight traffic, officially becoming a fugitive for the first time in her methodical, law-abiding life. Her phone buzzed incessantly. The lab, probably, or Agent Morrison trying to track her location. Elena powered it off and tossed it onto the passenger seat, severing her last connection to the world she'd built so carefully. The desert highway unfurled before her like a question mark, leading toward Vegas General Hospital, where 3 girls waited with blood that remembered things human DNA shouldn't know. The drive passed in a haze of adrenaline and second-guessing. Elena kept checking her mirrors, expecting federal vehicles to materialize from the darkness, but the highway remained empty except for long-haul truckers and insomniacs fleeing their own demons. The cooler sat beside her like a ticking bomb, its contents representing either the discovery of a lifetime or evidence of her complete psychological breakdown. By the time she reached Vegas General's parking structure, dawn was painting the eastern sky the color of old blood. Elena sat in her car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the hospital's imposing facade. She'd crossed the threshold now. Stolen federal evidence, fled a crime scene, committed career suicide for 3 children she'd never met. There was no path back to her old life, no explanation that would restore her reputation or her security clearance. But as she walked toward the hospital's entrance, cooler in hand, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the terrifying exhilaration of following truth wherever it led, regardless of consequences. She'd spent 47 years avoiding this feeling, constructing a life of careful boundaries and managed risks. Now, with everything familiar crumbling behind her, she discovered that freedom and catastrophe felt remarkably similar. The elevator ride to the pediatric ward passed in silence. Elena watched the numbers climb, each floor taking her further from the woman she'd been and closer to whatever she was becoming. Her reflection in the polished doors showed hollow eyes and graying hair, but beneath the exhaustion, something else flickered, the stubborn curiosity that had survived 17 foster homes and 4 decades of institutional conditioning. Dr. Chen was waiting at the nurse's station, his face drawn with fatigue and concern. "Dr. Vasquez, what are you doing here?" Elena hefted the cooler, meeting his gaze steadily. "I brought their blood work. The real results, before the federal government makes them disappear." His expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Federal government?" "FBI seized my lab an hour ago. Agent Morrison, national security protocols. They want the samples classified, buried, forgotten." Elena's voice carried a conviction that surprised her. "But these girls deserve answers, not another cover-up." Dr. Chen glanced toward the pediatric wing, then back at Elena. "The girls, they've been asking for you, specifically you by name. They shouldn't know your name." A chill ran down Elena's spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What did they say?" "They said the fire daughter would come home when the blood called to her." Dr. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dr. Vasquez, what exactly did you find in those samples?" Elena looked down at the cooler, thinking about cellular structures that moved with purpose, genetic patterns that resembled ancient script, DNA that defied every law of biology she'd ever learned. She thought about her own unopened history, locked away in the same institutional vaults that had swallowed these children. "I found proof that some stories are too important to let them disappear," she said, and walked toward the room where 3 impossible girls waited with blood that remembered everything. Tests and allies. The pediatric wing's corridor stretched before Elena like a gauntlet, each step echoing off polished floors that reflected fluorescent lights in wavering patterns. Dr. Chen walked beside her, his hospital badge swaying with nervous energy as nurses emerged from doorways to watch their passage. Word traveled fast in medical facilities. The overnight staff already knew something unprecedented was unfolding. "Room 314, Dr. Chen murmured, stopping before a door marked with cheerful cartoon animals that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances. "Fair warning, they're different than when you first processed them. The changes are accelerating." Elena's grip tightened on the cooler's handle. Through the door's window, she could see 3 small figures arranged in hospital beds, like points of a triangle, their dark hair spread across white pillows with geometric precision. Even from the hallway, she could feel the temperature differential. The air around the doorframe carried an unnatural chill that raised goosebumps along her arms. "Dr. Vasquez." The voice came from behind them, sharp with authority. Elena turned to see a woman in an expensive suit approaching, flanked by 2 men whose bearings screamed federal security. Agent Morrison had arrived at Vegas General with the same efficiency she demonstrated at the lab. "Agent Morrison," Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Following up on your evidence seizure?" "Following up on theft of federal property." Morrison's eyes fixed on the cooler with laser intensity. "Dr. Vasquez, you're in violation of multiple federal statutes. Return those samples immediately and we can discuss reduced charges." Dr. Chen stepped forward, his pediatrician's protective instincts overriding bureaucratic intimidation. "Agent Morrison, this is a medical facility. These children are my patients, not your jurisdiction. These children are classified assets in an ongoing investigation." Morrison's voice carried the weight of institutional power that Elena recognized from her own childhood, the absolute certainty that authority justified any action. "Dr. Chen, I strongly advise you to step aside." Elena felt the familiar paralysis settling over her, the learned helplessness of a foster child who discovered that resistance only led to harsher placement, more isolation. But before she could retreat into institutional compliance, something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the corridor dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The fluorescent lights began flickering in synchronized patterns, and from room 314 came the sound of 3 young voices speaking in perfect unison. "The Fire Daughter brings the blood memory home. The Watchers cannot touch what remembers itself." Every adult in the hallway froze. The words carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in bone and sinew, speaking to genetic memories buried beneath conscious thought. Elena felt recognition stirring in places she'd spent decades trying to forget, the certainty that she'd heard this language before, in dreams that felt more real than waking life. "What the hell?" Agent Morrison began, but her words were cut off as the hospital's fire alarm system activated. Not the usual electronic shrieking, but something that sounded almost organic, almost like singing. Dr. Chen was moving before Elena could process what was happening, pushing open the door to room 314 with the decisive action of a physician confronting crisis. Elena followed, cooler in hand, with Morrison and her agents close behind. The federal authority that had seemed so absolute moments earlier was crumbling in the face of something that transcended bureaucratic jurisdiction. Inside the room, 3 girls sat upright in their beds, no longer the traumatized waifs Elena had first encountered. Their eyes held depths that belonged to much older souls, and their synchronized breathing created visible condensation in the suddenly frigid air. When they turned toward Elena in perfect unison, she saw recognition that spanned decades, and something that might have been relief. "You brought the blood truth," Amira said, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "The Watchers tried to steal it, but blood calls to blood." "The fire memory cannot be caged," added Yasmin, her gaze fixed on the cooler with unsettling intensity. "It burns through their walls, their laws, their forgetting." Layla, the youngest, smiled with an expression far too knowing for her years. "Welcome home, sister-daughter. The blood remembers what the mind was taught to forget." Elena found herself stepping forward, despite every rational instinct screaming warnings. The girls' synchronized movement, their impossible knowledge, the way they spoke of memories as living things, it defied everything she'd built her worldview upon. But in their ancient eyes, she saw reflections of her own buried history, glimpses of the truth she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. "Dr. Vasquez, step away from the subjects immediately." Morrison's voice cut through the moment like a blade, but her authority felt hollow against the forces, gathering in room 314. The federal agent raised her radio, calling for backup that Elena suspected would prove inadequate against what they were confronting. Elena looked down at the cooler in her hands, then back at 3 impossible children who somehow knew exactly who she was and why she'd come. The blood samples inside contained answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask, but standing in this frigid room with girls whose DNA defied biology itself, Elena realized she was no longer just investigating a mystery. She was coming home. The moment stretched between heartbeats, silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and Morrison's increasingly urgent radio chatter. Elena's fingers trembled on the cooler's handle as 3 pairs of ancient eyes watched her with patient expectation, waiting for a decision that would reshape everything she thought she knew about herself. Dr. Vasquez, final warning. Morrison's hand moved to her weapon, though Elena doubted bullets would prove effective against whatever forces were manifesting in room 314. The temperature continued dropping, turning their breath to mist as frost began forming on the windows, despite the Nevada summer blazing outside. Elena stepped closer to the girls' beds, feeling the familiar weight of institutional pressure, attempting to crush her into compliance. But this time, something had changed. The terrified foster child who'd spent decades avoiding her own history was being replaced by a woman who had finally found her tribe, even if that tribe defied every law of genetics and physics she'd ever studied. "I need to run additional tests," Elena announced, her voice carrying newfound authority. "Dr. Chen, can you clear the room? We'll need privacy for the blood work." Morrison's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "You're not running any tests. You're surrendering federal evidence and submitting to arrest, or we're taking those samples by force." "Try it." The words came from a mirror, but all 3 girls spoke them simultaneously, their voices creating harmonics that made the 4 stands vibrate. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, creating a strobe effect that transformed the sterile hospital room into something from a fever dream. Dr. Chen backed toward the door, his medical training warring with self-preservation instincts. "Agent Morrison, perhaps we should call for additional personnel." "I've called for a full containment team." Morrison's radio crackled with updates about federal vehicles converging on Vegas General, hazmat protocols being activated, the hospital being quietly sealed. "Dr. Vasquez, you have 30 seconds to make the right choice." Elena looked at the girls, seeing her own fractured childhood reflected in their impossible circumstances. How many times had adults with clipboards and badges made decisions about her future without bothering to ask what she wanted? How many case files had reduced her to statistics and symptoms while ignoring the person beneath the trauma? "The blood remembers," whispered Yasmin, extending one small hand toward the cooler, "even when they try to make us forget." Elena's resolve crystallized. She'd spent her career cataloging genetic truth, but she'd never had the courage to confront her own biological mysteries. These girls represented everything she'd been too afraid to investigate, the possibility that her abandoned childhood held secrets darker and more wonderful than simple neglect. "Dr. Chen, I need your lab," Elena said, setting the cooler on the nearest bedside table. "Full genetic sequencing equipment, electron microscopy, whatever analytical tools you have available." Morrison stepped forward, her patience finally exhausted. "That's not happening. Johnson, Patterson, secure those samples." The 2 federal agents moved with practiced efficiency, but as they approached the girls' beds, the hospital room transformed. The temperature plummeted below freezing, turning the moisture in the air into swirling crystals that caught the strobing light like suspended stars. The heart monitors began displaying impossible rhythms as the girls' vital signs synchronized into patterns that defied medical explanation. Elena felt something awakening in her own blood, a warmth that spread from her core outward, fighting against the supernatural cold. For the first time in her life, the genetic memories she'd spent decades suppressing began surfacing with crystal clarity. Images of desert cities and ancient laboratories, of children with eyes like burning coals being studied by figures in robes and government suits. "The Watchers have been stealing us for generations," Layla said, her young voice carrying the weight of centuries. "But the Fire Children are waking up, remembering what we really are." Agent Morrison's radio erupted with panicked chatter from her backup teams, reports of electronic systems failing throughout the hospital, security cameras displaying impossible footage, federal vehicles experiencing simultaneous engine failure in the parking structure. Whatever was happening in room 314 was spreading beyond the confines of institutional control. Elena opened the cooler with steady hands, revealing the blood samples that had started this journey. But now she understood they weren't just evidence of genetic anomalies. They were proof that some bloodlines carried memories older than human civilization, older than the governments and agencies that sought to contain them. "Dr. Chen," she said, meeting his terrified gaze with newfound certainty. "Call your lab techs. Tell them to prepare for the discovery of a lifetime." Morrison raised her weapon, but Elena no longer feared institutional authority, standing in a room where 3 impossible children were rewriting the laws of biology through sheer force of genetic will. Surrounded by federal agents whose control was evaporating like morning frost, she finally understood why she'd become a scientist. Not to serve systems of power, but to uncover truths too dangerous for those systems to survive. The real test was just beginning. The weapon in Morrison's hand trembled as frost formed along the barrel, ice crystals spreading like living vines across the metal. Elena watched the agent's carefully maintained composure cracking alongside the hospital windows, which began spiderwebbing under the pressure of supernatural cold. "Blood calls to blood," the 3 girls chanted in unison, their voices weaving harmonics that made Elena's bones vibrate with recognition. The vials in the cooler began glowing with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The Fire Daughter must choose. Elena's greatest fear crystallized in that moment, not the federal agents or their weapons, but the terrifying possibility that everything she'd built her identity upon was a lie. 47 years of careful rationality, scientific skepticism, controlled emotions, the foster child's survival mechanism of never belonging anywhere, never claiming heritage or history. All of it threatened to shatter like the ice forming on every surface in room 314. "Choose what?" Elena whispered, though some deep part of her already knew. Morrison's backup agents raised their weapons, but the metal grew too cold to touch. They stumbled backward, breath steaming, as their radios erupted with reports of impossible phenomena spreading throughout Vegas General. Elevators moving between floors that didn't exist, security footage showing the same 3 girls in dozens of locations simultaneously, temperature readings dropping to Arctic levels in a building surrounded by 100-degree desert heat. "Choose to remember," Amira said, her 8-year-old face ancient with knowledge that predated human civilization. "Or choose to serve the Watchers who stole you from yourself." Elena's hands shook as she lifted one of the glowing vials. The blood inside moved like liquid fire, responding to her proximity with eager anticipation. Through the glass, she could see the impossible cellular structures she'd first dismissed as contamination, geometric patterns that resembled cuneiform script, DNA that folded into configurations textbooks insisted were impossible. Dr. Chen pressed himself against the wall, his medical training overwhelmed by phenomena that belonged to mythology rather than modern medicine. "Elena, whatever you're considering—" "I'm considering the truth," Elena replied, her voice gaining strength as genetic memories surfaced like flames in darkness. Images of herself as a child, not abandoned but taken. Memories of underground laboratories where children with burning eyes underwent tests that left no scars but changed everything. Scientists in government uniforms documenting bloodlines that stretched back to when humans first learned to fear the dark. Morrison tried to speak, but her words emerged as crystalline vapor. The supernatural cold was overwhelming even trained federal agents, driving them toward the door as the room transformed into something beyond their jurisdiction. Elena felt the cold too, but it didn't hurt her. Instead, it awakened warmth buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. "The Watchers hide us from ourselves," Yasmin said, her 10-year-old voice carrying the weight of countless stolen generations. They teach us we're broken, dangerous, better off forgotten. They give us new names, new histories, new families who never know what sleeps in our blood. Elena's foster care records, the convenient gaps in her early childhood, the way every family who'd tried to adopt her had eventually returned her to the system with vague complaints about nightmares, electronic malfunctions, rooms that grew inexplicably cold. She'd blamed herself for being unlovable, never considering that her very nature might be incompatible with ordinary human families. 47 years, Elena breathed, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. You've been hiding us for 47 years. The vial in her hand pulsed brighter, responding to her recognition. Around them, the hospital room continued its impossible transformation. The walls themselves began displaying patterns that resembled ancient Middle Eastern script, as if the building were remembering its own buried history. Morrison and her agents reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The electronic lock had frozen solid, trapping them inside with forces their training had never prepared them to face. Through the frosted windows, Elena could see the parking structure where federal vehicles sat dark and useless, their engines killed by electromagnetic phenomena that defied conventional physics. "This is your choice, sister-daughter," Layla said, her young voice gentle but implacable. "Remain the scientist they made you become, serving systems that cage truth, or remember the fire daughter you were born to be and help us wake the others." Elena looked at the glowing vial, then at 3 impossible children whose DNA had shattered everything she thought she knew about human genetics. Her entire career had been built on institutional authority, peer review, controlled experiments that produced predictable results. Everything safe, everything contained, everything that kept her from asking dangerous questions about her own origins. But standing in that transformed room, with frost painting impossible patterns on every surface, Elena finally understood that safety was just another cage. The test wasn't whether she could solve the mystery of these children's bloodline. The test was whether she had the courage to accept that their bloodline was hers too. Elena raised the vial to the light, watching ancient fire dance in blood that remembered everything, and chose truth over safety. The vial shattered against Elena's lips, not from impact, but from the impossible heat that erupted the moment the ancient blood touched her tongue. Glass dissolved like sugar in rain as liquid fire poured down her throat, carrying memories that belonged to 1,000 different lifetimes. Elena's scream echoed through room 314, but the sound that emerged wasn't entirely human, harmonics that made the frozen windows explode outward in crystalline cascades. For one transcendent moment, Elena felt herself expanding beyond the confines of human limitation. Her consciousness touched something vast and burning, a network of minds that spanned continents and centuries. She saw the truth of her people, the Jinn bloodlines that had walked among humans since civilization's dawn, shapeshifters and firewalkers, whose very existence challenged everything the Watchers sought to control. She was home. Then the pain hit. Elena collapsed to her knees as her nervous system overloaded, synapses firing in patterns her human biology couldn't sustain. The blood memory was too much, too fast. 47 years of suppressed genetics trying to awaken simultaneously. Her vision fractured into kaleidoscope fragments, herself as a 5-year-old with eyes like burning coals being sedated by men in lab coats, underground facilities where children learned to hide their fire beneath layers of pharmaceutical numbness, foster families paid to report any signs of anomalous development. "Sister-daughter, you're burning too bright," Amira's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The human shell can't hold so much truth." Elena's body convulsed as competing genetic codes warred within her cells, the Jinn heritage demanding transformation, expansion, the freedom to assume her true nature. The human modifications, decades, of carefully administered drugs disguised as vitamins, behavioral conditioning masked as therapy, fighting to maintain the cage they'd built around her fire. Blood poured from her nose, her ears. Her skin began crackling with patterns of light and shadow as her cellular structure destabilized. She was burning from the inside out, and there was no way to stop it. "Elena!" Dr. Chen's horrified shout penetrated the chaos. Through failing vision, she saw him reaching for the emergency medical kit, his training compelling him to help, even as his rational mind rejected everything he was witnessing. But Morrison was moving too. The federal agent had found a way past the frozen door lock, a maintenance override that bypassed the electronic systems. Her backup teams were flooding into the room, hazmat suits and electromagnetic pulse devices designed specifically for Jinn suppression. Elena recognized the technology from buried memories, weapons that had been used against her people for generations. "Containment Protocol 7, Morrison shouted over Elena's screams. "Full neurological suppression." The EMP blast hit Elena like a sledgehammer to the skull. The awakening fire in her blood guttered like a candle in hurricane wind as electromagnetic frequencies, specifically tuned to Jinn neurochemistry, flooded her system. The genetic memories that had been surfacing with crystalline clarity dissolved back into darkness, taking with them any hope of completing her transformation. Elena crashed to the floor, her body seizing as competing forces tore her apart from within. Half-awakened Jinn genetics fighting electromagnetic suppression, while her human modifications struggled to reassert control. She was caught between three incompatible states of being, and her cellular structure was failing under the pressure. "The blood truth!" Yasmin cried out as federal agents swarmed the three girls' beds. "They're stealing it back!" Elena watched helplessly as specialized restraints designed for Jinn bloodlines locked around the children's wrists, metal that channeled the same electromagnetic frequencies, now scrambling her nervous system. The girls' ancient eyes dulled as the suppression took hold, transforming them back into traumatized human children with no memory of their true nature. "No," Elena whispered, blood frothing on her lips. She'd been so close to understanding, to becoming what she was meant to be. But the Watchers had anticipated this moment, prepared for it across decades of careful planning. They'd let her find the truth just long enough to make losing it devastating. The last thing Elena saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Morrison, standing over her broken body, speaking into a radio with clinical satisfaction. "Subject 47 Alpha has been successfully recontained. Blood memory awakening terminated. Prepare neural reconditioning protocols for all subjects." The cooler lay overturned beside Elena's still form, its remaining vials dark and lifeless. The ancient fire that had danced in Jinn blood for millennia was extinguished, leaving only ordinary human samples that would reveal nothing more dangerous than statistical anomalies. In the silence that followed, frost began melting from the windows as room 314 returned to normal hospital sterility. 3 traumatized foster children slept under chemical sedation, their impossible heritage locked away once more behind walls of manufactured amnesia. Elena's greatest fear had come true. She'd found her family only to lose them again. The Watchers had won, as they always did, and this time she might not survive long enough to try again. The revelation. Elena's first thought upon waking wasn't about the sterile white ceiling above her or the 4 drip-feeding sedatives into her bloodstream. It was about silence, the complete absence of the burning whispers that had filled her mind for 47 years. The genetic static she'd learned to tune out so completely she'd forgotten it was there until it stopped. They'd won. The Watchers had successfully lobotomized her soul. She lay motionless on the hospital bed, cataloguing the damage with clinical detachment. Electromagnetic burns along her neural pathways manifested as a constant low-grade headache. Her cellular structure felt fundamentally altered, as if someone had rewritten her genetic code with corrections in red ink. Most devastating of all, the memories that had surfaced during her brief awakening were fading like dreams upon waking, leaving only the echo of profound loss. But something was wrong with their suppression protocols. Elena flexed her fingers experimentally, watching muscle and tendon move beneath skin that should have returned to ordinary human biology. Instead, She could see faint geometric patterns beneath the surface, the impossible cellular structures that had first appeared in the girl's blood samples, dormant now, suppressed by electromagnetic frequencies, but not destroyed. They'd made a mistake. The door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss. Morrison entered alone, her federal composure restored now that the supernatural elements were contained. She carried Elena's personnel file, not the official lab documentation, but the real one, the file Elena had never been allowed to see. "You're awake. Good." Morrison pulled up a chair, settling in with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "We need to discuss your future. Subject 47, Alpha." Elena's throat felt raw, but her voice emerged steady. "Elena. My name is Elena Vasquez." "That's the name we gave you, yes." Along with the fabricated childhood, the carefully curated foster care experience, the scholarships that guided you toward forensic genetics. Morrison opened the file, revealing photographs Elena had never seen, herself as a young child with eyes like burning stars, surrounded by scientists in underground laboratories. "Your real designation is Subject 47 Alpha, the most successful integration of Jinn bloodlines with human cognitive frameworks our program has ever produced." Elena stared at the photographs, watching her 5-year-old self undergo tests that looked more like torture. Electrodes attached to her scalp, blood draws that left her pale and shaking, behavioral conditioning that taught her to fear her own nature so completely she'd spent decades running from it. "You raised me to be your perfect genetic analyst," Elena realized, understanding flooding through her despite the neural suppression. "Someone with Jinn heritage who could recognize the bloodline markers, but human enough to serve your containment protocols." Morrison smiled, the expression devoid of warmth. "You've been invaluable. 17 successful identifications and subsequent captures over your career, including these 3 girls whose bloodlines are among the purest we've encountered in decades." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Every case she'd worked, every genetic anomaly she'd dutifully reported to her supervisors, she'd been hunting her own people, delivering them to the same underground facilities where she'd been broken and rebuilt into the perfect weapon against her own species. "The others," Elena whispered, "all those children I found for you, safe in our care, their dangerous genetics suppressed, their human potential maximized." Morrison's clinical satisfaction was nauseating. "Just like you. The electromagnetic conditioning we developed ensures complete integration with normal human society while eliminating the risk of supernatural manifestation." Elena closed her eyes, remembering fragments of cases that had haunted her. A 7-year-old boy whose blood samples had shown impossible heat signatures. Twin girls whose DNA contained geometric patterns that resembled ancient script. A teenager who'd been found after going missing for 3 months with no memory of where he'd been, but cellular damage consistent with extreme electromagnetic exposure. She'd delivered them all to Morrison's people, thinking she was solving crimes, protecting children, serving justice. Instead, she'd been perpetuating a genocide that had been ongoing for generations. "The girls," Elena managed, "Amira, Yasmin, Layla, what happens to them now?" "Neural reconditioning, followed by placement in carefully selected foster homes. Their memories of recent events will be completely erased and replaced with trauma narratives that explain any residual psychological symptoms. Within 6 months, there'll be 3 normal human children with no awareness of their true heritage." Morrison leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of false maternal concern. "The same can happen for you, Elena. The awakening you experienced was traumatic but reversible. We can restore your previous state. Brilliant scientist, valuable team member, purpose-driven career. All we ask is your continued cooperation in identifying others who carry dangerous genetic markers." Elena opened her eyes, meeting Morrison's gaze directly. For the first time in her life, she understood the true scope of the choice before her, not between safety and danger, or rationality and madness, but between serving her oppressors and honoring the blood truth they'd tried to steal from her. The geometric patterns beneath her skin pulsed once, faintly, despite the electromagnetic suppression. Elena smiled, finally understanding why she'd survived when so many others hadn't. She was never meant to serve them. She was meant to destroy them. "Yes," Elena said, her smile widening as Morrison's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. "I accept your offer completely." The federal agent relaxed slightly, but Elena could see the wariness in her eyes. Morrison had spent decades managing Jinn bloodlines. She knew better than to trust easy capitulation. "I'm pleased you're being reasonable. The alternative would have been unpleasant for everyone involved." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable." Elena's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before, despite the electromagnetic suppression humming through the room's hidden speakers. "In fact, I'd like to start immediately. There's so much I need to learn about your operation." Morrison's hand moved unconsciously toward her radio. "What kind of learning?" "Well, for instance, how many facilities like this do you operate? I assume the Nevada site isn't the only location where you've been processing Jinn bloodlines for the past 50 years. Elena shifted in the hospital bed, her movements casual but purposeful. The four-line tugged at her arm, feeding a steady stream of sedatives into her bloodstream, sedatives that should have been making her compliant, drowsy, easily managed. Instead, Elena felt more alert than she had in decades. "That information would be classified above your clearance level," Morrison replied carefully. "Of course, but surely there must be records I could access? Personnel files, transport manifests, genetic databases?" Elena's tone remained conversational, but something in her cellular structure was responding to her rising determination. The geometric patterns beneath her skin weren't pulsing with supernatural fire. The electromagnetic suppression prevented that, but they were changing, reorganizing themselves in ways the Watcher's technology couldn't detect, because they weren't looking for evolution. They were looking for revolution. "Elena, I think the neural trauma may be affecting your judgment. Perhaps we should increase your medication dosage." "Actually, I think my judgment is clearer than it's ever been." Elena sat up in bed, pulling the 4 from her arm with smooth efficiency. A few drops of blood hit the sterile floor, but instead of ordinary red, the droplets gleamed with faint geometric light that the room's sensors couldn't quantify. "For the first time in my life, I understand my purpose." Morrison was on her feet, reaching for her radio, but Elena was faster. Not supernaturally fast, the suppression prevented that, but fast with the focused precision of someone who'd spent 47 years learning to function within imposed limitations. Her hand closed over Morrison's wrist with grip strength that made the federal agent gasp. "You made one critical error in your reconditioning process," Elena said, her voice steady and clinical. "You taught me to analyze genetic data with obsessive thoroughness, to notice patterns others missed, to ask questions that led to uncomfortable truths." The pressure on Morrison's wrist increased incrementally. "Did you really think I wouldn't eventually turn those skills on myself?" Morrison tried to pull free, but Elena's grip was unyielding. "The electromagnetic suppression. You can't access your abilities." "I don't need supernatural abilities to destroy you." Elena's smile turned predatory. "I need human intelligence, scientific methodology, and 47 years of accumulated resentment, plus something you never anticipated. 3 children who showed me the truth before you could steal it back." The door burst open as Morrison's backup teams responded to her distress signal, but Elena had already released her, stepping back with hands raised in apparent surrender. To the entering agents, the scene looked like a minor medical incident: confused patient removing her 4, concerned federal supervisor maintaining professional distance. They couldn't see what Elena had transferred to Morrison during their brief contact. A single drop of blood, absorbed through skin contact, carrying cellular information that would take hours to manifest. Elena's partially awakened genetics, now dormant but still viable, beginning their slow integration with Morrison's human biology. "False alarm," Morrison announced, her voice controlled despite the growing burn in her wrist where Elena's blood had made contact. Patient appears stable. Maintain perimeter security. As the agents withdrew, Elena settled back onto the bed with theatrical weakness. You're right, of course. The neural trauma must be affecting me more than I realized. I should rest, recover, prepare for my reassignment to the program. Morrison studied her with new calculation. She could feel something changing in her bloodstream, a warmth that didn't belong there. But contamination scenarios took time to develop, and for now, containing Elena remained the priority. We'll begin your debriefing tomorrow, Morrison said. Full cognitive assessment, genetic stability review, loyalty confirmation protocols. I look forward to it. Elena closed her eyes, projecting exhaustion and compliance. It will be fascinating to see how your systems handle someone who's been on both sides of this war. As Morrison left, Elena smiled into the darkness. The Watchers had taught her to hunt her own people by making her believe she was saving them. Now she would use those same skills to hunt the Watchers themselves. The blood truth couldn't be destroyed, only suppressed. And Elena had just proven that suppression worked both ways. Phase 1 of her real awakening had begun. Elena lay in the sterile darkness for exactly 47 minutes after Morrison's departure, long enough for the federal agent to clear the immediate security perimeter, but not so long that the next shift change would bring fresh eyes to monitor her vitals. The electromagnetic suppression hummed through the walls like a mechanical heartbeat, but Elena had learned to work within its limitations rather than against them. She wasn't fighting the suppression anymore. She was learning from it. Rising from the hospital bed, Elena moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every action from this point forward carried irreversible consequences. The neural reconditioning Morrison had described wasn't just a threat, it was an inevitability unless Elena finished what the three girls had started when they showed her the blood truth in that overturned cooler. The facility's security assumed she was contained by electromagnetic fields and sedatives. They were monitoring for supernatural manifestations, genetic awakening, the kind of Jinn fire that had nearly destroyed her in room 314. What they weren't watching for was 47 years of human analytical skills being applied with newfound purpose to their own containment protocols. Elena approached the room's single terminal, her fingers finding the keyboard with muscle memory trained by decades of late-to-night lab work. The access codes Morrison's people had given her were still active. They expected her to need time to process her revelation before accepting their offer. Instead, Elena began systematically mapping every data pathway she could reach from her supposed medical isolation. Personnel records, transport schedules, genetic databases containing decades of Jinn Bloodline tracking. Most of it was encrypted beyond her current clearance level, but Elena wasn't trying to break their security. She was trying to understand its architecture, to identify the pressure points where a single piece of correctly placed information could bring down their entire operation. The geometric patterns beneath her skin pulsed faintly as she worked, not with supernatural fire, but with something more dangerous, clarity of purpose. Every name in the databases represented a child like Amira, Yasmin, and Layla. Every transport manifest documented families torn apart, bloodlines scattered, heritage stolen and locked away in underground facilities across the country. 57 locations, thousands of subjects. A genocide disguised as a protection program. Elena's fingers stilled on the keyboard as the true scope of the Watcher's operation crystallized before her. This wasn't just about 3 lost girls or 1 confused geneticist. It was about the systematic elimination of an entire species, carried out across generations with such clinical efficiency that even their victims didn't understand what they'd lost until it was too late. But Morrison had made one critical error when she'd revealed Elena's true history. She'd assumed that 47 years of conditioning would override 3 minutes of authentic awakening. Instead, Elena now had something no other Jinn survivor possessed: complete knowledge of the Watcher's methodology combined with the analytical skills they'd trained her to use against her own people. Elena began downloading everything she could access onto a portable drive hidden in her lab coat. Not the classified files, those would trigger immediate security responses, but the peripheral data that painted a picture of operations, schedules, vulnerabilities, the kind of information that would mean nothing to an outside observer, but everything to someone who understood how the Watchers thought, how they moved, how they maintained control over their scattered facilities. A soft chime indicated Morrison's return to the building. Elena closed the terminal and returned to her bed, but not before checking the faint burn mark on her own wrist where she'd made contact with the federal agent earlier. The wound was healing with unnatural speed despite the electromagnetic suppression, leaving behind a geometric pattern that matched the ones beneath her skin. The blood truth worked in both directions. If Elena carried Jinn genetics modified for human integration, then Morrison now carried human genetics being slowly modified by Jinn's cellular structures. The transformation would be gradual, subtle, designed to bypass the very suppression technology the Watchers relied upon to maintain control. Elena had infected their system with its own evolution. Footsteps approached her door, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Elena closed her eyes and regulated her breathing, projecting the deep rhythms of medicated sleep. But beneath her apparent vulnerability, every nerve was alive with anticipation. Tomorrow they would begin her debriefing, expecting to find a broken scientist ready to resume her role as their unwitting weapon. Instead, they would face someone who finally understood the true scope of the war they'd been fighting in the shadows for generations. Elena thought of the three girls, their ancient eyes now dulled by electromagnetic conditioning, their blood memories locked away behind walls of manufactured trauma. She thought of the 17 children she'd unknowingly delivered to this fate over her career, and the thousands more waiting in facilities she was only beginning to map. The final confrontation wasn't approaching. It had already begun the moment Elena chose to become the hunter instead of the hunted. Phase 2 would start with Morrison's transformation, but Phase 3 would end with every facility burning and every bloodline free. Elena smiled in the darkness, finally understanding what it meant to come home. The first sign that Elena's plan was working came at 3:47 a.m., when Morrison's vitals triggered an automated medical alert. Elena listened through the ventilation system as emergency protocols activated in the facility's medical wing. Hushed voices, rapid footsteps, the distinctive whine of diagnostic equipment being rushed into position. She could picture Morrison lying on a bed similar to her own, confused and frightened as her human genetics began their slow integration with something ancient and impossible. The blood truth couldn't be stopped once it started. Elena had learned that lesson 17 times over, watching children she'd delivered to the Watchers vanish into their electromagnetic conditioning programs. But she'd never understood the mechanism until now. How Jinn genetics didn't replace human DNA but rather rewrote it from within, teaching it new possibilities while preserving everything that made each person uniquely themselves. Morrison's transformation would take 12 hours to reach critical mass. Elena had that long to complete her preparations. She rose from the hospital bed and moved to the terminal again, but this time her access revealed something different. Morrison's biometric locks were fluctuating as her cellular structure shifted, creating brief windows where higher-level security protocols defaulted to emergency medical override codes. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading facility blueprints, transport schedules, and most critically, the electromagnetic suppression schematics that kept thousands of Jinn bloodlines locked in artificial dormancy. Every file painted the same picture, a war that had been raging for millennia, disguised as protection and preservation while systematically destroying everything that made the Jinn who they were. Elena found records dating back to the 1940s, government documents describing Jinn bloodlines as anomalous genetic variants requiring containment for national security. Children torn from families, adults disappeared into psychiatric facilities, entire bloodlines scattered and suppressed until they forgot their own heritage. The Watchers hadn't just been stealing Jinn abilities, They'd been stealing Jinn memory, Jinn identity, Jinn hope itself. But they'd made one critical error in their decades of careful planning. They'd trained Elena to be their perfect weapon against her own people, teaching her to recognize patterns that others missed, to ask questions that led to uncomfortable truths. Now, those same skills were being turned against them with 47 years of accumulated precision. Elena's wrist burned where she'd infected Morrison with her own partially awakened genetics, but the pain felt clean, purposeful. Each pulse of geometric light beneath her skin synchronized with data downloads that would soon make every Watcher facility vulnerable to coordinated assault. She wasn't just gathering intelligence, she was creating the foundation for revolution. A new alarm sounded, deeper and more urgent than Morrison's medical alert. Elena checked the terminal and smiled grimly. The Federal agent's transformation had reached the stage where electromagnetic suppression could no longer contain it completely. Morrison was beginning to manifest the same cellular anomalies that had first led Elena to discover the three girls' true nature. The irony was perfect. The Watcher's own suppression technology was designed to detect and contain Jinn awakening, but it couldn't distinguish between natural genetic activation and artificially induced transformation. Morrison's blood was singing the same ancient songs that Elena's had discovered in the Nevada crime lab, and the facility's sensors were recording every note. Elena began the final phase of her preparation. Using Morrison's fluctuating access codes, she penetrated the facility's communications network and began seeding it with a viral program she'd constructed from genetic analysis software. Not malware in any traditional sense, but rather a data pattern that would replicate through connected systems, carrying with it the electromagnetic frequencies needed to disrupt suppression fields. Every facility the Watchers operated relied on the same basic technology: electromagnetic conditioning to suppress Jinn abilities, neural reconditioning to erase Jinn memories, genetic monitoring to track bloodline activation. But Elena now understood that these systems weren't separate. They were networked, connected, vulnerable to the right kind of cascading failure. The blood truth wasn't just in the genetics, it was in the data itself. As Morrison's transformation accelerated, Elena felt her own suppressed abilities responding in resonance. Not breaking through, she wasn't ready for that yet, but growing stronger, more focused, preparing for the moment when she would need everything her heritage could provide. The geometric patterns beneath her skin pulsed in rhythm with the data patterns flowing through the facility's compromised network. Two kinds of ancient knowledge working in perfect synchronization. Footsteps approached again, but these moved with desperation rather than military precision. Elena closed the terminal and assumed her position of apparent rest, just as Morrison appeared in her doorway. The Federal agent's face was pale, her eyes wide with the terror of someone experiencing genetic awakening for the first time. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and Elena could see the faint geometric patterns beginning to emerge beneath Morrison's skin. "What did you do to me?" Morrison whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. Elena opened her eyes and smiled with genuine warmth. "I gave you the same gift you gave me, the chance to discover who you really are." The final test had begun. Morrison's transformation wasn't graceful. She stumbled into the room, one hand pressed against her throat as if she could physically contain the harmonic frequencies trying to escape. The geometric patterns beneath her skin writhed like living things, responding to electromagnetic suppression that was no longer calibrated for her changing biology. "You infected me," Morrison gasped, but her accusation carried undertones of wonder alongside the fear. "This is what they feel, isn't it? The children we take. This is what we steal from them." Elena rose from the hospital bed, moving with fluid precision that made Morrison step back involuntarily. The electromagnetic suppression that had contained her for hours was failing as her own genetics responded to Morrison's awakening. Two bloodlines calling to each other across artificial barriers. "You trained me to recognize patterns," Elena said, advancing slowly. 47 years of teaching me to hunt my own people by making me believe I was saving them. Did you really think I wouldn't eventually see the pattern in my own life? Morrison fumbled for her radio, but her fingers wouldn't obey properly. The Jinn genetics were rewriting her nervous system, teaching human reflexes new possibilities while dissolving the neural pathways that had made her so efficient at destroying what she was becoming. The suppression fields, they'll contain this. Your suppression technology was designed to control natural awakening in children, Elena interrupted, stepping within arm's reach. It can't handle forced transformation in an adult mind that understands exactly what's happening. You're fighting evolution itself, Morrison. How long do you think you can win? The federal agent's eyes were changing, human brown giving way to something deeper and more complex. Elena could see the moment when Morrison finally understood the true horror of what the Watchers had been doing. Not just stealing abilities or erasing memories, but murdering an entire species one child at a time while convincing the survivors to help. "The facilities," Morrison whispered, her voice breaking into harmonic fragments. 57 locations, thousands of subjects. My God, what have we done? You've created the perfect weapon against your own operation, Elena replied. A federal agent with full access codes experiencing uncontrolled genetic awakening in the heart of your most secure facility. The irony is almost artistic. Morrison lunged forward with supernatural speed, but Elena was ready. Her own suppressed abilities flared in response, and they collided in the center of the room with enough force to shatter the terminal screen. Not a physical battle, both women understood that violence would only bring more Watchers, but a contest of wills as two awakening bloodlines tested their limits against each other. I can stop this, Morrison snarled, her hands wrapping around Elena's throat with strength that should have been impossible under electromagnetic suppression. Neutralize you, contain the infection, maintain the program. With what? Elena smiled even as Morrison's grip tightened. Your human training, your federal authority, you're becoming everything you've spent your career destroying. How do you fight an enemy when you are the enemy? The geometric patterns beneath both women's skin blazed with synchronized light, and the facility's suppression fields screamed in harmonic distress. Alarms began sounding throughout the building as containment protocols failed across multiple levels. Elena felt her own abilities breaking through the electromagnetic barriers, like water through a cracking dam. Morrison's grip loosened as the truth hit her with devastating clarity. She wasn't just transforming, she was awakening to genetic memories that revealed every horror the Watchers had committed across generations. Every stolen child, every murdered bloodline, every family destroyed in the name of national security. The children, Morrison gasped, staggering backward. Amira, Yasmin, Layla, they're in conditioning cells 3 levels down. The suppression is killing them slowly, burning out their memories before their genetics can adapt. Then you know what we have to do, Elena said quietly, feeling the geometric fire spreading through her nervous system as her abilities finally broke free of artificial constraints. The only question is whether you're still Watcher enough to try stopping me. Morrison looked at her hands, watching the ancient patterns write themselves across her skin in languages older than human civilization. When she raised her eyes to Elena's, they held the weight of 47 years of misdirected purpose, finally finding its true target. The facility's suppression grid, Morrison said, her voice steady despite the harmonics. I have override codes for emergency shutdown. If we can reach the control center, every bloodline in 57 facilities breaks free simultaneously, Elena finished, thousands of Jinn remembering who they really are, the Watcher's worst nightmare made manifest. They stood facing each other in the wreckage of the medical room, two women whose entire lives had been weapons in a war they'd never understood until this moment. The facility shook around them as more containment protocols failed, and Elena could hear the distant sound of other awakenings beginning throughout the building. The confrontation was over. The revolution had begun. The control center lay 3 floors below, past security checkpoints that Morrison's biometric access could still navigate despite her accelerating transformation. But as they descended through the facility's sterile corridors, Elena felt the weight of what they were attempting settle into her bones like radiation. "Once we shut down the grid, there's no going back," Morrison said, her voice fracturing into harmonics as they passed another electromagnetic suppression node. "Every facility will experience simultaneous awakening events. Thousands of Jinn bloodlines breaking free at once." Elena's abilities pulsed stronger with each step away from the medical wing, but alongside the growing power came flashes of genetic memory that made her stagger. Not her own experiences, but inherited trauma from generations of her people who had faced this same choice: freedom through violence or survival through submission. "You're seeing it now, aren't you?" Morrison asked, steadying her as another wave of ancestral memory crashed through Elena's consciousness. "The blood truth works both ways. I'm experiencing every child we've taken, every family we've destroyed, and you're seeing what happens when Jinn try to fight back." The visions were devastating. Elena witnessed massacres disguised as psychiatric interventions, bloodline purges hidden behind national security classifications, entire Jinn communities vanishing into government facilities that officially didn't exist. Her people hadn't just been hunted. They'd been systematically erased from history itself. "The Watchers don't just suppress abilities," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her as they reached the control center's outer door. "They weaponize our own nature against us. When Jinn awaken en masse, when we remember what was taken from us." "Rage," Morrison finished, her transformed eyes reflecting the terrible knowledge they now shared. "Uncontrolled, justified rage that turns us into the monsters they've always claimed we are. The perfect excuse for complete extermination." They stood before the control room's entrance, Morrison's access codes the only thing between them and the revolution Elena had dreamed of since discovering the truth. But now she understood the real cost of victory. Freeing her people meant unleashing their accumulated trauma on a world that had no defense against supernatural fury. "The children in the conditioning cells," Elena said quietly. "How long do they have?" Morrison's face crumpled as her transformed awareness touched the electromagnetic suppression fields 3 levels below. "Hours, maybe less. The sustained conditioning is burning through their neural pathways faster than their genetics can adapt. If we don't shut down the grid soon—" Elena closed her eyes, feeling the choice crystallize with brutal clarity: save 3 girls and damn her entire species to continued genocide, or free her people and accept responsibility for the violence that would inevitably follow. The Watchers had engineered this moment perfectly, making liberation inseparable from atrocity. "There's a third option," Morrison said suddenly, her federal training finally finding synthesis with her awakening heritage. "Emergency protocols. If we trigger a catastrophic containment failure instead of a clean shutdown, it creates a narrow window, maybe 20 minutes, where suppression fields destabilize but don't completely collapse. Enough time to extract the children before full awakening events cascade through the network," Elena realized. "But only if someone stays behind to manually control the process. Someone has to regulate the field collapse from inside the control center." They both understood what that meant. The control room was hardened against electromagnetic interference, but manual regulation of a containment failure would require direct neural interface with systems designed to suppress Jinn abilities. Whoever stayed would be caught in the epicenter as 57 facilities worth of suppression technology overloaded simultaneously. Elena reached for the access panel, but Morrison caught her wrist. "This is my operation," Morrison said firmly. "My people, my responsibility. You get those girls out. I'll hold the center as long as possible." Elena felt tears tracking down her cheeks as she understood the true sacrifice being offered. Not just Morrison's life, but her awakening, her chance to finally discover who she was beneath 47 years of conditioning. The federal agent would die human, never experiencing the heritage that Elena had infected her with. When the facilities go down, Morrison continued, entering her codes with steady fingers, when your people are free, remember that some of us tried to choose differently at the end. The door cycled open, revealing the control center's gleaming banks of monitors and the neural interface chair at its center. Elena could see the electromagnetic suppression grid status displays, 57 facilities connected in a web of technological oppression that had contained her people for generations. Morrison moved toward the chair, but Elena caught her arm one final time. Your name, Elena whispered. Your real name, not your federal designation. The transformed agent smiled, her eyes holding depths that human genetics alone could never produce. Sarah Morrison. Tell the children that Sarah Morrison chose to remember. Elena ran for the conditioning cells as alarms began screaming throughout the facility, carrying Sarah's sacrifice toward 3 girls who would live to discover what their bloodline truly meant. The revolution had begun, but so had the reckoning. Elena's lungs burned as she sprinted down corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red. The facility convulsed around her like a dying creature, electromagnetic fields fluctuating wildly as Sarah Morrison sacrificed herself 3 floors above. Each pulse of failing suppression technology sent waves of awakening through Elena's bloodline, her abilities blazing brighter with every step toward the conditioning cells. The screaming had started 2 minutes ago. Not human screams, those would have been merciful, but the harmonic death, songs of suppression fields overloading throughout the facility. Elena could feel other Jinn awakening in cells scattered across multiple levels, their confused terror mixing with sudden, explosive power as decades of forced dormancy shattered simultaneously. She reached the conditioning wing as the first cell door buckled outward, torn apart by 8-year-old hands that shouldn't have possessed such strength. Amira stood in the wreckage, her small frame wreathed in geometric light patterns that pulsed with each ragged breath. The child's eyes held depths that Elena recognized from her own reflection, the terrible beauty of a bloodline remembering itself. "Where?" Amira asked, but her voice carried harmonics that made the corridor walls vibrate. "Not where am I?" Elena realized. "Where have you been? Where were you when they took us? Where were our people when we needed them?" "I'm here now," Elena whispered, kneeling to meet the child's blazing gaze. "We're going home." The second cell door exploded outward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Yasmin emerged, walking through electromagnetic suppression fields that should have contained her, 10 years old, and radiating power that made Elena's awakened abilities feel like candle flames before a bonfire. The girl's face held expressions far too ancient for her age, genetic memories cascading through her consciousness faster than her young mind could process. "They made us forget," Yasmin said, her words fracturing into multiple harmonic layers. "Made us think we were broken, sick, wrong. But we remember now. We remember what they did to our mothers." Elena felt her throat close as she understood. The girls weren't just awakening to their own abilities. They were inheriting the accumulated trauma of every Jinn bloodline the Watchers had destroyed. 47 years of systematic genocide flowing through children's minds like liquid fire. The facility's main power grid failed with a sound like reality tearing. Emergency systems kicked in, bathing everything in pulsing amber light as containment protocols collapsed across all levels simultaneously. Elena could hear other awakening events accelerating throughout the building, adult subjects breaking through suppression fields with violence that shook the reinforced walls. She found Layla in the third cell, 12 years old, and standing perfectly still in the center of electromagnetic chaos that should have been killing her. The oldest girl's transformation was the most complete and the most terrifying. Her eyes held depths that spoke of genetic memories reaching back centuries to times when Jinn had walked openly among humans before the first Watchers learned to hunt them. "Sarah Morrison is dying," Layla said calmly, her child's voice carrying undertones of absolute authority. "She chose sacrifice over survival. Should we honor that choice, or let her transformation complete naturally? Elena staggered as she realized what the girl was asking. Sarah's neural interface with the control systems was burning through her partially awakened genetics, but her federal conditioning was fighting the process. With enough power channeled through the failing suppression grid, the girls could force her transformation to completion, saving her life while potentially destabilizing every facility in the network. She chose to let you live free, Elena managed, gathering all three children as the corridor began collapsing around them. Honor that choice. They moved through the facility like beings from another world, Elena's awakened abilities guiding them past security checkpoints while the girls' raw power cleared obstacles from their path. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of other Jinn subjects breaking free, some calling out in joy, others screaming with rage at memories they could never unknow. The main exit appeared through smoke and flickering emergency lights, but as they approached, Elena felt Amira's small hand slip into hers with crushing strength. "The others," the 8-year-old said simply. "We can't leave the others." Elena looked back at the facility convulsing in its death throes, filled with Jinn subjects experiencing uncontrolled awakening events. Some would emerge transformed and free, others would burn out from the neural stress, dying as their minds tried to process centuries of inherited trauma. All would be forever changed by this moment. "We come back for them," Elena promised, leading the girls toward dawn light that seemed impossibly bright after so long in artificial corridors. "All of us, together. We remember who we are, and we come back for everyone they took from us." As they emerged into the Nevada desert, Elena felt the electromagnetic pulse as Sarah Morrison's sacrifice reached its conclusion. 57 facilities falling silent across the nation, thousands of Jinn bloodlines suddenly free to discover what their heritage truly meant. The revolution was over. The reckoning had just begun. The Nevada crime lab stood exactly as Elena had left it 6 weeks ago, but everything felt impossibly small now. Fluorescent lights that had once flickered like dying stars now seemed dim and fragile against her transformed vision. The familiar chemical smell of reagents and disinfectant couldn't mask the electromagnetic signatures she could now detect, every piece of equipment humming with energies she'd never noticed when she was still purely human. Her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Chen, looked up from his desk as she entered, his relief visible. "Elena, thank God. When you disappeared after the Morrison case, we thought—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. Elena caught her reflection in the darkened window. To human eyes, she probably looked healthier than she had in years. The geometric patterns beneath her skin were invisible unless she consciously activated them, and her awakened genetics had burned away decades of accumulated stress and exhaustion. But something in her posture, in the way she moved through space, spoke of fundamental change. "I found them," she said simply. "The Haddar girls. All 3 of them." Marcus's face cycled through confusion, hope, and growing unease. The missing foster children? Elena. That case was closed after the federal investigation. Agent Morrison filed her final report before... He paused, clearly struggling with classified information he couldn't discuss. "Before she died, shutting down a government facility that was experimenting on children with anomalous genetics," Elena finished quietly, before she chose to remember who she was instead of what they made her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications Marcus couldn't fully grasp. Elena could see him trying to process her words through a worldview that had no room for supernatural bloodlines or federal conspiracies. Part of her envied him that limitation. "The girls," Marcus said finally. "Where are they now?" Elena moved to her old workstation, her fingers trailing across equipment she'd once operated by instinct alone. Now she could feel the electromagnetic fields each machine generated, could sense the quantum fluctuations in their electronic components. Everything was exactly the same, except for her. "Safe," she said, "with their own people, learning what their heritage actually means instead of being taught to fear it." Through the lab's windows, she could see the sprawl of Las Vegas in the distance, lights that had once seemed brilliant now appearing fragile against the desert darkness. Somewhere out there, in facilities disguised as research centers and treatment hospitals, other Jinn bloodlines were still awakening from Sarah Morrison's sacrifice. The electromagnetic pulse that had freed 57 locations hadn't reached everywhere. Elena's transformed awareness could detect suppression fields still operating in at least a dozen installations the Watchers had kept off their official networks. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "you've been through trauma. Losing contact for 6 weeks, dealing with whatever happened during that federal operation. Maybe you should consider taking some time, getting professional help." She turned to face him, allowing just enough of her true nature to surface that the geometric patterns beneath her skin became faintly visible in the fluorescent lighting. Marcus stepped backward involuntarily, his human instincts recognizing something that didn't belong in his ordered world of evidence and analysis. "I am taking time," Elena said gently. "Starting now. I need to request extended leave." Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number, 3 more facilities located. Colorado, Maine, and Northern California. When you're ready. Amira. The 8-year-old who now carried genetic memories spanning centuries, whose child's voice could harmonize with frequencies that made grown men weep. Elena had left the 3 girls with a community of awakened jinn hidden in the mountains east of Reno, but she'd known the separation was temporary. They were bound now by more than their shared experience. Their bloodlines recognized each other, called to each other across distances that human understanding couldn't measure. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena considered lying, offering some normal explanation he could file away and forget. But looking at this man, who'd been her colleague for 8 years, who'd covered for her obsessions and trusted her instincts even when they defied logical explanation, she found herself offering a different kind of truth. "Until we find all of them," she said. "Every child they took, every bloodline they tried to erase. Until the Watchers understand that we're not hiding anymore." She gathered her personal items from the workstation, a coffee mug with a joke about DNA analysis, a photo of her adopted daughter from years ago, a small cactus that had somehow survived her neglect. Ordinary objects from an ordinary life she was choosing to leave behind. Marcus watched her pack, his face cycling through emotions he couldn't name. "Will we see you again?" Elena paused at the laboratory door, feeling the pull of ancient obligations that her genetics finally understood. Somewhere in the darkness, Amira and her sisters were waiting. Somewhere beyond that, other facilities held children who deserved to discover their true heritage before the Watchers' suppression technology burned through their minds completely. "Ask me again when every child is free," she said, and stepped into the Nevada night where her real work waited. 3 months later, Elena stood in the morning light outside a small clinic in Northern California, watching as the last transport vehicle disappeared over the hills with 17 more children who would never again be told their abilities were a sickness to be cured. The coastal fog was lifting, revealing a landscape that seemed impossibly green after so many weeks in Nevada's harsh desert. Her phone displayed 47 missed calls from Dr. Marcus Chen, the numbers growing more desperate over the past month. She'd stopped answering after the first dozen, unable to explain why she couldn't return to a life of analyzing trace evidence when children were still trapped in facilities that treated genetic heritage like a disease. Some transformations, she'd learned, were irreversible. "That's the last one on the West Coast," Amira said, appearing beside her with the silent grace that all awakened Jinn possessed. The 8-year-old had grown taller in the months since their escape, but more than that, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who finally understood her place in the world. "Yasmin says the underground networks have confirmed it. No more active suppression sites from Seattle to San Diego." Elena nodded, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in her chest. 43 facilities dismantled, over 300 children relocated to communities that would teach them to embrace their abilities rather than fear them. The Watchers had fought back, Government agents appearing at liberation sites, official documentation trying to classify the rescued children as federal assets, legal challenges that would have been insurmountable if Elena still believed in purely human solutions. But awakened Jinn didn't operate within human legal frameworks. They moved through electromagnetic shadows, communicated across distances that surveillance technology couldn't monitor, and protected their own with abilities that federal agents couldn't adequately prepare for. The revolution Sarah Morrison had died to enable was succeeding beyond Elena's most optimistic projections. "The families want to honor her," Layla said, emerging from the clinic's entrance with 3 younger children who still moved hesitantly, unused to spaces without suppression fields. The 12-year-old had become something like a coordinator for the liberation efforts, her genetic memories providing strategic insights that complemented Elena's forensic training. A memorial gathering. "Will you come?" Elena considered the invitation, imagining Sarah Morrison's federal colleagues learning that their dead agent was being mourned by the supernatural community she'd helped free. The irony would have appealed to Sarah's sense of justice, Elena thought. A woman who'd spent her career hunting anomalies finally remembered by the very people she'd been trained to contain. "She chose to die human," Elena said quietly. "Maybe we honor that by living free." Her phone buzzed with another message from Marcus. "Elena, please, just tell me you're alive." For a moment, she almost called him back, almost tried to explain how she'd discovered children being held in electromagnetic suppression chambers, how their DNA had revealed bloodlines that connected to beings human science didn't recognize as possible, how Sarah Morrison had sacrificed herself to prevent those children from dying in conditioning cells designed to burn supernatural abilities out of their minds. Instead, she typed, "I'm alive. I'm exactly who I was always meant to be." The response came immediately, "That doesn't sound like you." Elena smiled, watching the fog clear completely to reveal mountains that stretched toward horizons she'd never imagined exploring. Marcus was right. This didn't sound like the forensic geneticist who'd spent 8 years analyzing trace evidence under flickering fluorescent lights. That woman had been searching for answers in places that couldn't contain them, trying to solve mysteries while missing the biggest truth of all. She typed back, "Ask me again in a year, when the last facility is closed." "There's something else," Amira said, her child's voice carrying undertones that made Elena look up sharply. "The community elders want to meet with you. They say it's time to discuss what comes after." After. Elena hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, too focused on immediate rescues to consider what their people would do once the emergency phase ended. But the 8-year-old was right. They were approaching the conclusion of something that had begun the night 3 foster children appeared on Interstate 15 with DNA that couldn't be explained by human science. "After we find them all," Elena said, pocketing her phone without reading Marcus's response. "After every child knows their real heritage." She walked toward the transport vehicle that would carry them back into the mountains, leaving behind the last traces of her old life. Somewhere in Nevada, the crime lab continued its work without her, analyzing evidence and solving cases that belonged to a world she'd outgrown. Somewhere else, Marcus Chen still believed she might eventually return to explain what had happened to his colleague. Elena knew better. The woman who'd discovered the Haddar girl's true identity was gone, transformed into something that could navigate both human and Jinn realities without losing herself in either. She'd found her answer in the space between worlds, in the moment when ancient genetics finally remembered their purpose. The revolution was ending. Her real work, helping freed children discover what their bloodlines could accomplish when they were no longer afraid, was just beginning.